Ladies and gentlemen, our next panel, Improving Customer Clarity. Please welcome to the stage moderator Courtney Kuby and our distinguished panelists.
Well, thank you. I'll let you grab your seats while we get started. So far this morning, the panels here have really delved into this report card, the National Security Innovation-Based Report Card. But this panel, we're going to look at what was the lowest scoring indicator, and that's customer clarity. It scored a D. What would have gotten you a signature from the parents back in school, but so we're going to talk a little bit more about it here. And we're lucky here today because we have a panel of people who can talk about it from both sides. We can get the perspective from the hallways of the Pentagon, the hallways of Congress, and then the customer side as well of this issue that clearly needs to be addressed. I want to start, Congressman Rob Wittman. You are the Vice Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. You're also the Chair of the Tactical Land and Air Forces Subcommittee, which I'm sure our audience knows, focuses on systems and equipment, but also for all the services, and also it touches on the procurement issue for the services. So I just want to start with a broad question.
Sure.
Is the U.S. government a good customer?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. Where it's not a good customer is sending a constant demand signal. And certainty is what business need. Businesses need that certainty because when they plan to make investments, to put on workforce, to be able to look in the long term, they need that certainty. Where the government is a bad customer, I think begins with Congress. You cannot be consistent in the things that we need to do for our nation's defense by year after year after year putting forth continuing resolutions. You just can't do that. And then finally, when an appropriation bill goes through, many times you have 6 months, 7 months, 8 months to spend 12 months worth of money. It's very inefficient to be able to get that out of the door. And then what happens is that becomes the annual roller coaster ride. And for a lot of businesses, they look at it and go, you know, I'd love to do business with the Department of Defense, but I'm not going to get on the roller coaster because I can't run a business like that. So in that sense, the government's not a good customer. In the other sense, on the scale of what the government does and the things the government needs, it could be a good customer because many of these companies, especially startups and emerging technologies, look at what they have and they say, hey, there's a place for what we produce in the government. On the other side, sometimes it's almost impossible to navigate. So if you don't have somebody that helps you say, is there a requirement? How do I actually get my foot in the door? How do I get this in the hands of soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen to determine, will this work in the ways that I think it will work for the military? That also has to be simplified. So the opportunity for folks is a good one. The mechanisms, both on acquisition within the Pentagon, need to modernize, need to operate at the speed of relevance, and Congress needs to stop this roller coaster ride of CRs in order to make sure that the Pentagon and the private sector has that constant demand signal.
Alan Lord, you served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. I'm reading that because I don't want to get that title wrong. But basically,
A&D.
Yeah, all right, yeah. I'm sure that everyone here again knows that that involves the policies and processes involved with the Pentagon's acquisition and contracts and logistics and the defense industrial base. But you also served as the Vice Chairwoman of the National Defense Industrial Association. So I want you to pick up on something that Congressman Wittman just said. What's the disparity when you're dealing with the U.S. government if you are a large contractor, defense contractor, who's used to dealing with the government as a customer versus some of these smaller ones that are more of a startup or that have sort of this more emerging technology that they're trying to sell to the government? What is the disparity there, and how do you think that could be addressed?
So there's an enormous disparity there because the large primes, for instance, have structured themselves around their customers so that they have the infrastructure, if you will, to understand how the department's put together, who actually has decision authority, who has budget authority, how to conduct a campaign, if you will, in D.C. with all of the different stakeholders, because everything in D.C. is a campaign. Whereas if you're a small company, it is very unclear how you approach. And I'll tell you, even having been in industry for 33 years before coming into government and being with a mid-tier, I knew when I came in very unexpectedly to government that I didn't know very well how it worked. Well, I got inside and I realized I knew next to nothing because we had wasted an incredible amount of time talking to people who did not have the decision authority. Now, on the flip side, the upside is much greater for smalls because even if you get just a modest contract with the department, you are then branded as being a DoD supplier, which is enormous if you're trying to raise capital, hire employees, and so forth. And again, the breadth and depth of what you can do is amazing. Now, typically people don't know what the easy lane is to get into the department, but there is actually an industrial policy team within the Undersecretary of Acquisition and Sustainment group that can help with that. They actually have a placemat, if you will, that was developed several years ago as to all the steps you have to take. So there are ways to do it. But it's challenging, and often if you're a small, kind of my final comment is you can only afford so much overhead and G&A to go and pitch from a business development point of view, develop proposals, which can be rather onerous as well. So you have to make that critical decision, in my mind, of where do you go it alone so that you are the prime, and where do you do smart partnering with someone who has the contract vehicles who needs your technology. Because often it is more difficult to find a contract within DoD to move your application forward than it is to get the money.
Eric Fanning, you are the Aerospace Industries Association President and CEO. You were also Secretary of the Army, Acting Secretary of the Air Force, other senior positions in the Navy, OSD, budgets, planning, personnel, weapon system acquisition. Couldn't get hired by Space Force? Is that what it was? You got everyone else. Okay. All right, we'll give you that. All right, still at Space Force, so he gets to come on his resume. You told a recent congressional hearing that there was an uneven or uncertain demand signal that was, and it impacted surging weapons and it impacted efforts at stockpiling weapons. Can you explain a little bit about what that means and any ideas that you have for addressing that?
Sure. First, I'd start by saying that the Defense Industrial Base, the National Security Innovation Base, which is a term I like better, is not monolithic. And I think oftentimes people treat it as one entity. It's an ecosystem. Every part of it is important. It's like taking insects out of the natural ecosystem. Big companies, mid-tier companies, small companies, companies that don't consider themselves necessarily defense companies but can contribute to national security. They're all important. And what we're seeing though is for national security, there's a customer. And it sets the contours of the industrial base that supports it. And so we have never needed the weapons, munitions in particular, at such rates as we are needing them now, both to support Ukraine, to think about Taiwan, but to make sure our own stockpiles are sufficient. And it's a hard thing to crank up overnight when the customer has been buying a certain way, by necessity, really, because it's very expensive to have surge capacity or to have bulging warehouses, stockpiles. But when you've been buying a certain way for 20 years, the industrial base builds around that. It's infrastructure, it's workforce, it's supply chain, all the way down to original materials. And so to crank that up overnight is a difficult thing to do. And I think when the war started, everyone was sort of pointing fingers when in fact we got to where we are for a number of reasons. And part of it is, we talk about the top line for the Department of Defense, but I think you got to start with what you're asking the Department of Defense to do, and are we resourcing it properly? Because every year is a trade-off. The Congressman goes through it. Ellen Lord went through it when she was in government. I did when I was in government as well. And certain things are easier to trade off than other things. And that's where we find ourselves now. Is you start with what are we asking the department to do internationally, and how do we support that and make sure that we have some capacity, because we budget for, we posture for, we warehouse for peace in a way without thinking about what has to happen if we have a long duration conflict.
So one thing that I've been struck by with Ukraine is that, while there's so much focus in the defense industrial base and the national security industrial base on emerging technology, is that Ukraine has actually shown that older technology actually still is important. So tanks, right? Yeah, tanks, trench warfare. I'm sure there's a lot of people in this room who like to hear that older technology is still important too. But it really has shown that at the end of the day, you still need that. But that what's also become clear is that there is a very real bottleneck that exists when you're having to surge equipment forward. So I want to ask each of you, I'll start with you, Congressman Whitman, where is that bottleneck? Where do you see that it's held up to be able to surge equipment?
Sure. Well, the bottleneck to me is process related. So as you're looking to be able to surge or to adapt quickly to circumstances that change, our systems, especially the Pentagon, isn't very agile. And it's not set up to act at the speed of what I call relevance, and use that term from the past. But I think what needs to happen today is we need to understand, how can we make changes to that acquisition system? And I see Mac Thornberry is here. Mac, through a number of years as both ranking member and chairman of the committee, made it his purpose to make sure we did acquisition reforms. So about 5 years, every year there were significant acquisition reforms that took place. What happens many times, though, is those tools are there, but many times they don't get used. So the question then becomes, how do we make sure those tools are used? How do we make sure, too, that we understand how to look forward? One thing we know about what happens in looking at things like the 5-year defense plan or the POM, most times we get it wrong. You try to look in the future and all of a sudden we go a little bit in the wrong direction. And the problem with the Pentagon is it's very difficult to then redirect at the speed of relevance. So then you go off in this direction and then you have to turn the aircraft carrier in order to get it back on track. What we have to be able to do is to change the process so that it's more driven by immediate needs, and it's more driven too at levels closer to the warfighter. So, and we've done some of that. We've been able to lower thresholds or raise thresholds to where people can purchase without having to go through OSD or OSD CAPE. Those things are incredibly important. The thing too that we need to look at is there are certain elements within the military where they can purchase very quickly, they can adapt to circumstances. The great example is special operations. Special operators, because they're a small community, if they're going to look at it, they're going to test it out, they're going to try it, and guess what? They're going to have it in hand in a short period of time. The Marine Corps also is pretty adept at doing that because they're a smaller organization. What we have to be able to do is to adapt the lessons learned from special operations and from the Marine Corps about how to do acquisition quickly, about how to adapt to changing circumstances so that we make sure we have in hand what we need. We cannot go through the process that we've seen that, again, it's dictated by peacetime, but think about it. In March was year 20. It was actually year 22. Year 20 from the time F-35 started on a piece of paper to now production. And we're not even in full-level production yet. So think about that. You cannot take that long to be able to modernize those systems. And that's just one example. But we have to be able to use models that are already there about doing acquisition quickly, being able to adapt to circumstances that are occurring now so that we can be ready for what occurs in the future. And we have to be better at predicting the future and not go all in one direction. So to say, listen, the future may hold a couple of different things. Let's span where we're going instead of very narrowly focusing where we're going.
Do you agree? And is the government capable of being flexible in that way?
Yes, I agree. However, I think it's larger than acquisition. Acquisition is a challenge, but in fact, our entire system of how the Department of Defense gets money, works with OMB, works with the executive branch, works with Congress, is a very complex system called the Planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution System. And it just so happens there's a Congressional Commission. Eric and I are one of 14 commissioners. Arun's here. I see Jonathan Burke is here as well. And we're tasked with looking at how you make those changes. And I think the root cause of our ability, Raj is also on the commission, still back there. Sorry, Raj.
Trying to
hide. Looking for you. A very important commissioner.
Yeah.
So bottom line is the whole process was set up 60 years ago when we thought we could predict the future, when the Department of Defense did the most of the innovation. Now the commercial sector does most of the innovation. And so how do we scale and tailor the process from a requirements generation point of view, a planning, programming, budgeting point of view? So not only can we take the time to develop the requirements for the very exquisite platforms platforms, aircraft carriers, manned fighter jets. But how do we delegate down the decision authority? So if you want to buy, hundreds or thousands of attritable drones, or you want to purchase software as a service for satellite imagery on the battlefield in Ukraine, or to look up at what's going on in LEO at in low Earth orbit when you are going to launch a commercial or a military satellite to make sure you don't smash into space junk or another satellite, you've got to be able to move quickly. And right now, we have these small bastions of innovation, whether it be DIU, whether it be the Rapid Capabilities Offices, whether it be SOCOM, the Marine Corps. The challenge is the authorities are not there to scale that appropriately. So that's what we're looking at, and it's going to take some fundamental changes. And one of the largest challenges is everything is so centralized in the department. So it's going to take some intestinal fortitude by leadership to have the faith to set out the direction and then delegate authority. There's also, kind of final thought here, ambiguity. We go from the National Defense Strategy to the defense planning guidance, but there's not really the articulation of stop building this, start building that. So there becomes a whole nother interpretation loop of what did they really mean by that, which takes time.
That kind of gets to one of, again, the issue of these smaller companies that may be doing the innovation on their own and having to foot the bill for it in many cases. So is that another place that is a bottleneck? And again, how do you get the government, which has just never really been agile, to put their money where their mouth is if they really need some of these technologies and either fund it or give some sort of a demand signal that they're going to need these technologies to encourage these smaller companies to come forward with new innovation?
Well, I think going back to the industrial base not being monolithic, different parts of it have different problems. As Doug Bush said in the previous panel, some things should take a long time to build. There are exquisite platforms that literally have one customer. No one else is buying aircraft carriers. Where there are examples of the ability to be agile and move quickly, like with Special Forces and the Marine Corps, they might be experimenting with things and buying things that are dual use and have a commercial application, and so there are other customers which allows that speed there. So, the big companies have this problem with the inconsistent demand signal from government. The smaller companies have all sorts of other barriers that they feel more acutely because they don't have the same overhead, as Ellen said. And the government's not an easy customer to move from a prototype, especially if you've developed it yourself, then to a production level. And one thing, you have someone who served in Congress for a long time, someone who served in industry for a long time and went to government. I was in government a long time and went to industry. And there are a lot of lessons I learned in that transition that would have helped me when I was in government. And one, I think that government as a whole doesn't understand the private capital that is leveraged by the Department of Defense. But there's a timeline to it. And that's one of the main problems for small companies is, one of our members said, if the Air Force buys $700 million worth of drones from me, it thinks it gets $700 million in drones, which is true. But then it gets $5 billion in the next round of investment that company puts to work. And that's a new model for the Department of Defense, this commercial equity capital that's being put to work for R&D. But that accentuates and makes even more severe the problem of that timeline of getting, this new budget, the president's budget that came out has enormous research and development investments, which is great, but there has to be a path for that to get to production, and it has to exist within those investment cycles, or those investors will go someplace else.
If I could just build on that, the last panel talked about we're great at innovation from a science point of view, not quite so good at engineering. I would say we are even less proficient at innovation in business practices. So as we are trying to get industry to make investments on their balance sheets and want to provide software as a service or other services, the department doesn't quite know how to buy that. And frankly, Congress has given all the authorities. It's been translated in policy and implementation guidance, but there's not always the training, and frankly, there's not always the leadership that says, let's just, go and fail fast and kind of get the reps and sets and practice this. So that whole business innovation is holding some of this back.
Is there some way that Congresswoman, that Congress or maybe DOD can sort of incentivize investments in dual-use technologies?
I think there is. There's been some steps in that direction. I think more needs to happen. You see the Office of Strategic Capital has been set up to try to attract capital. I've talked to the director there. I think they have the right mindset. The question is will capital follow? Will folks say, yes, I have faith in this, I'm willing to go ahead and be part of that? Another element that needs to happen is there are barriers within the rule sets for how to move technology forward, how to scale technology. Listen, for years under CBER, we have a lot of phase 1 and phase 2 companies do a great job in RDT&E. What happens, though, is many of those concepts that should be applied struggle because they can't scale. And here's one of the elements. Not everything needs to be a government-funded project. A lot of it needs to be, let's look at these dual-use technologies or others, and let's see if they can actually get to that critical mass. What happens, though, under phase 3 is there's a requirement there that says if you have more than 50% VC dollars involved in your business, you're out. You don't get a phase 3 grant from the government. So it's mind-boggling to me. So if private investors think, I'm willing to risk my money on this because I think it has a future. In fact, I'm really willing to risk more of my money on that. The government says, oh, no, my gosh, we don't want to be part of that. It's counterintuitive. So we have to change that. We also have to look, too, at how do we keep up with all the aspects of where capital flows in. Venture capital, which is shorter term, higher risk. Private equity, many times for those companies that are starting on that slope to be able to scale. How do we make sure that those entities are fully involved in how the Department of Defense is making decisions, and that the Department of Defense is encouraging that? I think the Office of Strategic Capital has some promise. I think there are more things that we can do to really put this on afterburners, because we are not going to be able to pace technology and applying technology within the military solely as a government enterprise. We can't do it because of the scale. So the question is how do we scale leveraging that private capital? How do we scale other technologies that are going on? There's a whole realm of things where we can take the lead and where we can make quantum leaps. Things like 5G, things like what's happening in space. The private sector is on afterburners there. You know, instead of the military going, gosh, we need to have our own requirement for this or program of record, you know, we need to find opportunities to say, why don't we take advantage of what's happening there? How do we enable those dollars that are being invested to make sure that we leverage that to a higher scale for government? I think we can do that. It is foreign, though, as a matter of practice within the Pentagon. It's the mindset of, you know, this got to be a government-based program, and it's got to ultimately end up in a program of record. No, listen, if the requirement's not there, there is our OTAs and MTAs, so that you can graduate other transaction authorities, mid-tier transaction authorities that aren't used enough. The problem is sometimes, too, Congress says, whoa, wait a minute, especially appropriators. So, whoa, wait a minute. You know, one-time authorizations, we don't like that because we like to have the control. Congress, the Pentagon, and others have to give up some of that control, be willing to take some more risk to see what blossoms and what does not, be willing to fail, because that's the track that's going to send the signal, too, to innovators out there to say, hey, I've got a chance. Let me see what we can do there. That's, too, how we're going to leverage the capital necessary to really make the quantum leaps to keep up with China. At RDNF, I held up a blank sheet of paper and said, this is what the Chinese start with, 11 by 17 sheet of paper. This is what the Chinese start with. No impediments. And then I held up the flow chart for acquisition in the Pentagon. 11 by 17 sheet of paper. You could not read the writing on that flow chart. That's what we're dealing with. So I tell folks, listen, we can't erase everything and go to a blank sheet of paper, but we got to be able to simplify that flow chart so that process-wise we get to where we need to go faster, and we're not afraid to fail.
But the one big difference
Yeah.
is that the U.S. government has oversight and they have scrutiny.
Yes.
So when you talk about a program, especially a very expensive program, failing, then everyone, oh, look at that was money wasted.
Yeah.
There was, you know, taxpayer dollars that were wasted on this. So how do you think, Ellen, you could get past that? I mean, oversight is a wonderful thing, right? You know, we don't want to get rid of the oversight, but how do you think you get past that fear of failing and look at it more as development? Is there a way for the Pentagon to do that and for the Hill?
I think one of the challenges is the lenses people have. In the Pentagon, you want to execute, you want to get capability downrange quickly for the warfighter, so we have overmatch. On the Hill, they want that as well. However, they feel that it's, their duty to make sure taxpayer dollars are appropriately spent. And it's hard to justify failure, if you will, back home. Yet, I think if we looked at things incrementally and did a higher cadence of communications between DOD and the Hill, because right now it is very constrained given the budget cycles, and explain what we're doing, and then ask for some room to maneuver there in terms of redeploying funds in the year of execution, so to speak, be able to say, oh, this great technology just bubbled up, but I'm stuck because I've got to wait for this requirement to come down from joint staff and blah, 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 so I can't use it. If we allowed the building to have that decision authority and had Congress be a little bit more comfortable with undefined pools of money, and that's the dilemma. People on the Hill feel they are incredibly responsible for each one of those dollars, and the fact that you might not have dollar for dollar specified against a specific objective is a little bit worrisome. So one of the things that's been discussed in the whole ecosystem, because this PPBE commission is great in that all these other commissions have popped up around town, whether it be the Atlantic Council or other ones. This is great input with the scorecard. People come up with lots of ideas, and one of the things we hear over and over again is, why don't we move from just program elements that are so narrowly defined to capability elements, and give people in the department some more decision authority so that their hands aren't tied, so they can adjust, they can do things more rapidly. And frankly, not everything needs the same level of oversight, but flexibility is equated to risk a lot of the time. And we tend to be very risk averse because, frankly, a program failure makes much better copy than a program that went along swimmingly, right?
Yeah, you think about interceptor tests, and every time one
Right, right, it's clickbait.
I think, maybe we stop using the word failure. It's really about learning, and I think that gets to some important points here that have come up. First of all, the Pentagon still operates, the government still operates as if this innovation and technology is being developed on the government side, and hasn't adjusted to the fact that there are certainly technologies and innovation that are inside the middle of the defense industrial base, but a lot of it's on the outside, and they're not set up to bring that in or to operate in the same way. This failure loop, I think we should stop using that word. It's about learning. It's about learning. It's about learning faster. It's how technology is increasingly. On the private sector side, it iterates differently than it did 50 years ago. I mean, we were the last institution in the world probably to have BlackBerries at scale, because Apple was like, you don't even know how to, this updates at night. You think you're buying something for 5 years, when in fact it's just the platform for what you're buying. And the Pentagon still hasn't really learned that, I think, in an important way. And then second, when you think about, dual use, or commercial companies, or companies that are primarily commercial, you're talking about an ecosystem that can go someplace else if the department makes it too difficult to work with. And certainly there are requirements that we need to make sure the warfighter is protected and resilient and what have you, that are different than I need, walking around town. But if we have this compliance and regulatory bureaucracy layered on the national security side, these companies will just go someplace else. And then finally, third is workforce. And in our world, in the industry side, we talk about workforce all the time. It's probably the biggest strategic concern for the CEOs in industry. But there's a workforce issue on the government side too, not just the people. And Ellen worked on this day and night when she was in government, and talks about it still now. It's training them. There are always more authorities than are being utilized, but part of that is to train people to use it, make them aware of the authorities, train them how to use them best, but then you really got to back them up. Because this gets back to the failure, because we talk about learning early, failing early, but then we shoot those people when they do. And so we've got a real workforce issue on the government side too, where there has to be that understanding, that training, and that in a different conversation about risk and where to apply it.
I want to take some questions from the audience. I don't know if we have mics or not, but just shout. Right here, sir.
So a question for the group, would be particularly Mr.
There are actually mics,
Oh,
excuse me, Courtney.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, you can't hear the question if you're not in the room.
Yeah.
I know that from the green room, yeah.
So Matt Waters from McKinsey. Quick question for you, Mr. Fanning, and love others' thoughts as well. But when you mentioned kind of the iPhone updating at night, there's constantly talks about kind of buying things as a service. And I'm curious how you think about kind of capabilities as a service for things in hardware. You see a lot of innovation on the private sector side. You don't see so much buying behavior from the government thinking about things as a service. Thank you.
I do, service is such a broad term, and just AIA, which is over 100 years old, when manufacturers, things you could drop on your foot or fly or what have you. Now the Pentagon spends more on services than it spends on hardware. And there's a reason for that, but again, it's a very broad term. But I think it's not just where innovation happens, but it's that iteration. I think that we've seen a lot of success in service, in space, in a lot of different areas because the private sector is not just innovating faster, but it's that iteration. They can do those things that government can't do left to its own devices. Not so much because of authorities, that's a part of it, but again, just how the government bureaucracy is structured. And so outsourcing that a little bit as a service so that you can work those iterations faster is important. I mean, just look at the operating systems on computers, and eventually they just become worthless, bricks on your desk because the government can't keep up with that refreshing.
I think this goes back to the issue of the pace of innovation. And the pace of innovation is such that DoD cannot have as many subject matter experts as they need in all the different domains that they're working. And they also now having space as a contested domain, working undersea so much more. There's a lot that needs to be done with a finite number of dollars. So to make those dollars stretch, I think you need to rely on industry to make the capital investments, to make the IRAD investments, put that on their balance sheets, and then come up with a business model where the department can turn it on or off like a spigot, use O&M money, which has much less oversight, frankly, than RDT&E and procurement. So I think it's incredibly important for the future of DoD to buy many things as a service. It's frankly been done for the last 15 years with ISR as a service, looking at UAS. However, we get back to the training issue. All the authorities exist to do this. It's pretty flexible. You can have big IDIQs and task orders you can put out so you make it happen quickly. But the workforce has not gotten enough vignettes to show how it can be applied. Right. So if you don't have senior leadership that understands that, you don't have a middle group that understands it, and you don't have early career people that are encouraged to use it, it's not going to happen quite as much. But I think it's probably one of the largest levers that DoD has in terms of stretching the dollars and making sure that we maintain overmatch or increase that. And that's truly a partnership with industry. But again, it's not just the technology. It's the engineering, it's the application, and it's the business model.
Yeah. And I think, too, the Pentagon tends to be parochial just by its very nature, and it's also very hardware-centric. Everything is mindset, hardware, hardware, hardware. I think, though, they're beginning to realize that as things open up with artificial intelligence and other ways to enable either existing systems or enable new technologies that aren't as hardware-centric, you have to be able to open up your aperture about how you think. And we actually do some of that. We have programs where we say, hey, listen, there's private capacity out there. We don't need to duplicate it on the government side. You look at the Maritime Security Program. We hire ships to carry U.S. cargo, and when necessary, when the balloon goes up, they automatically convert to logistics for the United States military. The same with the new tanker security program. We finally got that in place to say we have to have tankers there because we need them to carry fuel. The civilian reserve component of the air fleet, to where we do airlift through that process. Another place that we need to do it today, as space grows with both LEOs, MEOs, and GEOs, is we need to have an analogous program in space. We need to have a space security program. We say, listen, let's ensure that a certain amount of government traffic takes place on these satellites in all orbits and all constellations. And then if the balloon goes up, guess what? just flip a switch, and they're all there layering to make sure we have what we need in what we know is going to be a heavily contested environment. So I think some of that mindset is there. It's happened in other ways, but it's very difficult to get away from hardware towards software, because software and services are much more difficult to understand and understand the applications. And when the understanding is not there, and we talked about training and education, when the understanding is not there, the tendency is to say, oh, no, 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 because I either don't understand it or I can't put my hands on it, and that becomes a little more difficult in the acquisition community.
It's important to have a balance, too. It's just like the workforce on the government side.
Yeah.
Should a job be in uniform or wearing the total force? Should it be outside as a contractor? Should it be organic as a civil servant? The Pentagon needs to make sure, for our nation's security, that we have the capability and capacity when we need it. And so some of that we can certainly buy as a service, but there are other customers often for some of those things too. So we need to make sure we have the balance right in terms of, this goes back to the original question I think about surging. Capacity is a capability in and of itself that we need to think through, so that we're not just buying for that one day in peace. We're thinking about what happens when we get into a kinetic situation, especially if there's duration to it.
And that's the fundamental issue, is this lumpy demand signal doesn't allow a CEO to go to their board and say, hey, let's invest this money. Well, what's the return on that? You don't know if you don't have more than 1 year money.
Yeah. And I think, too, strategy has to drive that. Strategy has to drive what needs to be our organic capability. What's the floor for organic capability within the military? And then, Eric, just as you said, what do we add on top of that so we have that surge capacity? That can be done, and it should be NDS-driven. It should be service-driven about things that happen there. The problem is that whether it's an O plan or a COCOMS, they get to that tangentially, but they never get to the center of that and say, how do we build that capacity and capability issue?
And you're buying a potential versus something you can actually park on a ramp or store in a warehouse.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's buying an option.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Howard Whitesnow with Rebellion Defense. Thank you for your comments. You spoke about process, training, authorities. My question's about culture. I would argue that the higher order problem connecting all of these is we have a culture of execution when we need a culture of innovation.
Yeah.
Culture's hard to change and doesn't change overnight, which says we have to get started yesterday. What are your thoughts on how do we shift the culture that I think really is necessary to unpack and unlock the innovation needed to achieve all the other things you're speaking of?
I think it comes down to motivations and rewards. And right now, the motivations and rewards are not sufficient to really drive that.
Yeah, I think, too, that there is that culture in the Pentagon that's sort of it's what's called the frozen middle. You have warfighters said, hey, give us this, that, and the other. They're pretty innovative in the way they think. You have folks in the upper echelons of the Pentagon that said, hey, let's change process to make these things happen faster. And the folks in the middle go, you know what? I've been here before Whitman was here, and I'm going to be here after Whitman leaves. So what we need to do is to change the motivating systems there. We actually got some language in last year's NDAA that said for program managers, if you find efficiencies, we're going to allow you to bring those resources back to your program. And then we're going to give the program manager the flexibility as to how to use those resources. So if they say, listen, we need to buy more software, hardware in order to become more efficient to do more of this, they can do that. Or if they say, hey, listen, we've got a group of people here that are just busting their fannies. They're here till 8 o'clock every night. They're the ones that drove the progress on this. We're going to make sure that they get bonuses. So it's on an annual basis. So it's not something that is continual. But when you find those efficiencies, there has to be a reward for that. Because if not, it becomes all process driven. It's like, check the box, collect my paycheck, go home, come back tomorrow, check the box, collect my paycheck, go home. It has to be more of a sense of urgency. And listen, I don't want to cast aspersions on everybody in the middle management Pentagon. There's some really creative and thoughtful thinkers there, but there are also others that are not. So the question is how do you, as you said, change that organizational culture to where the innovators and the drivers become the norm, and that internal pressure in the Pentagon pushes those that aren't performing either to perform or say maybe it's time to move on somewhere else.
Culture's very hard to change. That's a very good question. There could be a whole panel, a day on that. I think another word here we're talking about is incentives.
Yeah.
You got to reward in a number of ways, but it's not just the culture of the Pentagon. And as the Congressman said, there are good people there. Secretary Gates had this great line in his farewell speech where he said that bureaucrats and bureaucracy are different. No one suffers a bureaucracy more than the bureaucrats who have to fight it every day.
Yeah.
But there are external influencers too.
Yeah.
When you're a senior leader in the Department of Defense and you go to the Hill, especially if you're testifying, you're being asked for heads on plates. Who's responsible for this? Who did you shoot? Who did you fire? And I was always looking for a head to put on a plate, but you can never really point that out. Because often the program manager who's riding something into the mountain is living with decisions that were made 4 generations before him or her. And so it definitely has to be the incentives. We have to find lots of ways to reward people who are doing these things. Get away from talking about how someone failed, but how someone learned and got there faster. And we reward their program. We give them more flexibility and autonomy and authority. But then we reward those individuals too.
Yes.
There got to be paths forward. If you want to be the chief of staff of a service, that's not generally the lane that you go through. So we have to find ways where we can reward people and give them really interesting paths, especially on the uniform side, but also on the civilian side, where they can come back to operational commands, which is what people want in the Department of Defense, both on the uniform side and the civilian side.
So it's interesting. I thought that when we were talking about incentivizing innovation, we were talking as much about the private industry, private sector, but it sounds as if you all agree here that the incentives also need to be largely focused on the DoD itself and on the military.
Absolutely.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. Plus, as a reporter who gets called on, I love calling on people. It's like this weird sense of power that I get to call on people. They're in the back.
These are retired force guys.
Hi, everyone. Mike Holmes from Red Six and the Roosevelt Group. One of the things that we haven't talked about is that from being a programmer for 3 years and helping build, the Air Force budget for 3 years, anything that comes in, although the budget grows, microscopically every year or maybe more, inflation, anything that comes in has to displace something old that's in there. And often the constituencies that are lined up behind something old are bigger and more powerful than the one behind something new. My wife is a writer, and she taught me that you have to be willing to murder your favorite children to get to a book, that works right. You may have written it and loved it, but it doesn't fit the story anymore, and it's got to go, and you have to be willing to do that. That's really hard to do when you're the person that's trying to bring all these inputs together, sort through all of it, all the constituencies. The frozen middle often is just stuck trying to please too many customers, and you can't put anything new in unless something old goes. How do we get after that? How do we get willing to let the old things go so we can bring in something new? Thanks.
Well, listen, I think it has to be done. I am fully in favor of retiring legacy systems. The problem with how the Pentagon goes about retiring legacy systems is the gap. So if you look at the divest to invest strategy, we're going to divest in cruisers, in LSDs, ones that still have life left in them. So you have a cruiser that has 120 plus VLS tubes on it. So we retire that, and the replacement for that doesn't show up inside the fighter. So you're looking at go, well, how do we make up these multiple ships that have now hundreds of VLS tubes? And the question is, well, we'll build something in the future. Well, that's just starting the execution 5 years out. That doesn't mean that ship or capability is going to be there. Where the failure is to get those curves to intersect. So your divestment curve, your retirement curve that starts to take down assets like this, and your investment curve, bringing assets back, is here. And it's always separated by multiple years. And the service branch chief that says, let's divest in these legacy platforms isn't even going to be around to try to put in place the investment in those new platforms. And I've talked to the CNO and all the chiefs about this. The way you will get Congress and others to agree on retiring these legacy platforms, which has to happen, is to get those curves to intersect. And there are ways that we can do that. Listen, you can provide those capabilities in different ways without having to worry about how do we bridge that gap. If you can't show where that gap is bridged, those things are almost impossible to achieve. And there is a parochial aspect to it. So if you're retiring aircraft, they're based in somebody's district. So the question is I think most members are reasonable. They say, listen, we understand if you're going to take these aircraft out, finally, great example, A-10s, finally starting to go out of the inventory. So you take those out. As long as the member understands, hey, listen, as we're bringing new aircraft in, we're going to make sure that things happen at your base. And it may not even be aircraft. It may be some other capability that the Air Force is developing or the other service branches. But you have to be aware of the parochial aspect of those assets going away. And you have to make sure that those curves at least touch each other so that people feel comfortable about the gap that we're going to try to bridge. If you don't do that, then that's where the resistance comes from Congress. And I think you'll find if you can make sure that that capacity and capability is at least addressed, I think you can get there. And I agree, legacy platforms have to go, but you can't replace something with nothing.
And that brings us right back to the report card where we started, because it talks under customer clarity about the need for the government to make trade-offs.
Yes.
When it's talking about it. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We have a very quick break, just enough time for all of you to praise us on all of our discussion up here today. It might take a few minutes. The next panel is going to start at 11:15, so grab your coffee, and then thank you all for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ellen, thank you.